Hello, my name is Nathan Ashley, and this is my presentation for my prototype system. Today I will be focusing on Battlefield's destruction, specifically the destructible environment mechanics. This is an example of what the destructible environment looks like. The first introduction of the destructible environment mechanic or system was in Bad Company, introduced as Destruction 1.0, where most small buildings and cover could be damaged piece by piece, such as walls, roofs, windows, other things like that could all be destroyed individually. The game to actually prioritize this mechanic, however, was Bad Company 2, where they introduced Destruction 2.0. This made it so that entire buildings could topple and introduced the first introductions of Levolution. Now, the entire point of this video is to figure out how we're going to actually make this thing. So, how might we actually make our own destructible environments? Now, the way that I saw it, there were about 3 ways that I could go about making this system. I could use the Chaos Destruction plugin, I could follow a tutorial, or I could make it myself. From the image to the right, you can see I decided to do all 3, technically. I'll get into it later. So just to explain a little bit about these different ways that we could solve this problem, the Chaos Destruction plugin allows for static meshes to be created into geometry collections, which can be broken into pre-cut segments. So what that means is that it creates a geometry collection that holds information and says, if it's broken, fracture in this way. There are a lot of pros and cons to this, but some of the pros are it is really good at large-scale destruction and that the fracturing method is artist-driven. Some of the cons are that it's pretty heavy setup at runtime, and the setup/content needs a lot of assets for one thing to be destroyed. It can get quite heavy on processing very quickly. Next is the video tutorial. This is a little kind of screenshot I took from it that gives it was a really good way to get a good idea of how I might create this thing and was a really good starting point. The con, however, was that this actual tutorial did not work in Unreal Engine 5. So that means that I had to go and actually create my own system. Wow. So this is my system. You can watch it at that link, but some of the pros are that all the cuts are at runtime. All the content is low cost, which means that it works with any static mesh. You don't have to make any geometry collections or anything like that. It's good for small amounts of destructible items, such as and maybe selecting a certain amount of items in a level that you want to be destroyed. I don't know. Maybe you just want specific boxes being destroyed, or if you want any static mesh in the level to be destroyed, you can select it with the system. The cons, however, is that performance can spike with complex static meshes because, the more complex it is, the more fractures and the more breaking points it has, and it's just a lot more computations. On top of that, all the physics and everything like that you have to do on your own, so you have to put that in your code instead of just relying on the plugin to do it for you. And overall, it's just more work than using the Chaos Destruction plugin. Here's the code for the system. It starts with the procedural mesh actor, which is the actor that is swapped in place of the static mesh that is then destroyed. Next, we move on to the static mesh to procedural mesh actor. This converts static meshes to procedural meshes. This half of the static mesh to procedural mesh copies the procedural mesh around the static mesh and then adds collision before destroying the old static mesh. Next, we have our on-hit event in the first-person projectile. This is where most of the actual logic that performs the explosion happens. This is the first function I'll be talking about. It is the hit impact slicing. It checks to see if the component is sliceable and slices the mesh at the hit location at a random rotation. And this is the second half of the hit impact slicing function, where we simulate physics and gravity to the procedural mesh halves or chunks. And finally, here is the code for the explosion slicing function. This is the first half where it gets the bounds of the procedural mesh and slices it in half depending on the hit point. And this is the second half where it enables collision, simulates physics, and separates the chunks of the procedural mesh, basically causing the explosion. Moving on from the code and talking about what went right and wrong during the creation of this system. Overall, things went pretty well. I created the system, it looks pretty good, and it functions well. Not much else I can say there. I think I did a decent job of recreating the very basic Destruction 1.0 from Battlefield Bad Company. Alright, let's move on to what went wrong. In general, not a whole lot went wrong in the creation of this system. It went pretty smooth. I looked at the tutorial for some guidance, used what I could, what I couldn't, and then built my own stuff from there. And the reason why I had to end up building my own stuff was because the procedural mesh was not simulating physics, and the collision channels were not lining up. So I had to do my own code in the blueprint to make sure that that stuff turned on.